Hello and welcome to Planet Poetry. My name's Robin Houghton.
And I'm Peter Kenny. And in this episode we learn how to think like a poet.
Finally. I need to know.
Which is the name, actually, Robin, of a new book by academic author and poet Dai George.
And Peter and I share a bit of festive banter about snowy mountains, steam trains and carol singing. And I'm looking forward to actually finishing a novel written by a famous OuLiPo practitioner.
Oh, yeah.
And then to bring us back down to earth, Peter's going to read for us a lovely poem that wishes good riddance to the old year and welcomes the new one in with open arms.
But before all that, let's hear what Dai George had to say to us.
Dai George was born in Cardiff in 1986 and is lecturer in creative arts and humanities at University College London. His poems and criticism have appeared in The Guardian Online, The Boston Review, New Welsh Review, Poetry Review, The White Review, The Lonely Crowd, and many other magazines and anthologies. His two poetry collections, The Claims Office and Karaoke King, are published by Seren, and his first novel, The Counterplot, is an Audible original. How to Think Like a Poet is his first work of non-fiction, published by Bloomsbury. So, Dai George, welcome to Planet Poetry.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
This is a very unusual interview, isn't it? Because Peter's here as well. Peter, what are you doing here on my interview?
Well, I'm just gate crashing. I found this book too interesting not to barge in.
So the first question is, where in the world, on the planet, are you?
I am in Harrow, northwest London, Zone 5. More specifically than that, I am in the room where my son sleeps for the time being.
Your baby son?
Yeah, well, he's 19, 20 months.
Okay.
Toddler would be more accurate now.
We're going to talk about how to think like a poet. It covers 24 poets. It's almost like a brand new canon of poetry. First of all, I guess what I want to ask is, what gave you the idea to write this? Was it a purely academic demand or something that was a passion project for you?
Certainly not an academic demand. If anything, a general readership, trade publishing demand. I need to be a bit honest about that as part of the genesis of the book. Sometimes as a writer, you need to be a little bit opportunistic. You need to spot where there's an opening and go for it. So that's kind of what happened with this. It's part of a series run by Bloomsbury Continuum, which has other How to Think titles, which follow a broadly similar format. So that's kind of the very boring answer. But the more interesting answer is that I saw how it could be a vehicle to write the kind of the popular critical book I'd always wanted to do so as a generalist. So obviously I am a practicing poet for what it's worth. I have a PhD in poetry and poetics, English literature rather than creative writing. So I've thought and wrote about it in that more academic way. But actually my bigger passion is usually to be a communicator to as bigger audience as possible, to not talk down, assuming that people won't get it or need soft kid gloves to enter into some of the pleasure of poetry.
It's an interesting line to walk, isn't it? As you say, you're an academic, but you want to appeal to a generalist audience. And I think what does come across is this interesting mix. You pepper the whole book with idiomatic phrases and to make it sort of very kind of accessible, I suppose. And yet you also give us a huge amount of detail about the lives of these poets and the times that they lived in. So it's sort of educational in that sense too. So are you wanting to suck people in to poetry who perhaps think it's, a bit frightening or a bit irrelevant?
Yes, I absolutely am. On the basis that they are people too, whom poetry could speak to. I wouldn't say that they're the main target audience. I'd be pitching the book just as much to people who like poetry, who have a place for it in their lives already, but maybe want to spend more time with it. And it was a bit of a litmus test for myself, I suppose, as I was writing it. would my hardened poetry friends and practicing contemporary poets like me, would they find it interesting too? And that's another reason why I wanted to write it and how it came about. I saw that there was maybe an opening for a book about the canon, which would appeal to the contemporary poet as well. Somebody who really knows their stuff about what's going on right now and writing in an exciting way often, but for good reason hasn't gone through the sort of canonical, traditional English lit educational background and would like to know more and would respond to writing about the canon, which was also responsive to the way we write now and the concerns of the ethical concerns, the formal concerns of contemporary poetry.
One of the things I really got from it was your enthusiasm. And I guess I knew almost every poet in here, but it rekindled my enthusiasm for going back to them. It's such an amazing overview. And I think the people that you have chosen they're such good choices as well in terms of it brings you to this moment now and shows the sort of currents of the various poets over the years that have led us to this point almost. So I really take my hat off to you for that. But I wonder about...
Thank you.
Did you feel guilty about leaving any poets on the bench? You know, you've got this 24, this like first team, and then there's all the surly substitutes, you know, sitting around thinking, why not me? Was there anyone you felt bad about dropping?
Perils and dramas of selection. Yes, I did feel bad, but I think ultimately I made peace with it quite easily because like you just tie yourself in knots and like it would be an existential drama that would stop you writing this type of book at all if you worried too much about it. You have to stop somewhere. I did worry about making sure that the global gender and racial representation that I tried to capture wasn't tokenistic, while also acknowledging the fact that there are real historical reasons why the canon has been founded on male and white identity. And that was a legacy I wanted to wrestle with honestly in the book. But actually, a more fun answer, perhaps, is to let you in on my substitutes bench, because I had an initial 30 chapters planned. It's important to say that the 24 poets I've got here aren't my faves. I think that there is a combination of love, respect, and acknowledging where they sit in the scheme of things. I did have to cut some chapters in the end because of the way I was writing the book. The idea is that the chapters in this series would be somewhat shorter and more biographical in nature, you know, and not have that like meatier close reading that I was very keen to preserve as part of it.
Right.
And they let me run with that. And so because the chapters were each like turning into about 3,000 words as the natural length of it, I couldn't do all 30. So that was the compromise. Anyway, without further ado, the substitutes bench, I'm just going to pull up the document where I jotted this down.
In any particular order of kicking out?
No, chronological. Like
chronological, okay, good.
Yeah. So a non was going to sit, I was going to have How to Think Like a Non.
A non.
And I do regret not having time to write that chapter. And so did my editor, actually. He was very keen that that should be there. But I was getting to the real kind of nitty gritty of edits and space. And
you might have trouble with the biographical details of a non.
Well, yes, exactly. So I think a non was going to sit between Li Bai and Rumi as a sort of way of acknowledging the role of a non in Anglo-Saxon and early English poetry, but then talking about how the anonymous poet is a phenomenon throughout history as well. So in the end, I tried to do justice to that in the introduction. Okay, I'll rattle through these a bit more quickly. William Blake, Christina Rossetti, Arthur Rimbaud, Gertrude Stein, Derek Walcott, and Seamus Heaney.
Oh, Walcott and Heaney were on my list there. I was thinking, they could have been.
Yep.
Interesting.
Because it was part of the selection criteria that I wouldn't do a dedicated chapter to somebody still alive and writing.
Okay, yeah.
Now, each chapter is titled How to Think Like X, How to Think Like William Shakespeare. And, there's a kind of hubris to that built into the architecture of the phrase, how to think like Shakespeare, right? Yeah. Who am I to say? But that becomes a sort of happy fiction. For somebody who's still alive and writing, who could put their hand up and say, no, I don't think like that at all. It just, it felt like a step too far. So, yeah, I was making calls, wasn't I? About where the real joints of significance in the story I was telling lie. Gertrude Stein is possibly the one I very much regret losing, because I was aware as I was writing it that I wanted more of a flavour of poetry as disjunction and rupture, the kind of very modernist use of language leading on to even weirder postmodern and experimental contemporary uses of language. I wanted to do right by that, and to actually show that I celebrate it as well as part of poetry's rich tapestry. Because at times I've mentioned that, contemporary poetry can be a little bit inward looking and resistant to being read by a wider audience. And so I had concerns that perhaps I would end up shortchanging that great legacy of writing that flows out of Gertrude Stein and Tender Buttons. So I would have loved to have her as well. Rimbaud would have been cool, because I think that there's a bit of a gap in the book from continental Europe. Rimbaud and Rilke were people I was tempted to include.
Scope for a sequel, though.
Yes. And I think that How to Think Like a Poet 2, Keep on Thinking, would be, in some ways, it would be the more interesting selection task.
Yeah.
Because I'd have already done big names like Dante, and I could just afford to be more personal in the choices.
Yeah. Well, I think you've explained very clearly that this is part of a series, How to Think. So I certainly understand better now why it's called that and why the chapter headings are How to Think Like So-and-so. We should say, for listeners, we're talking about who's not in the book. We should give a flavour of who is in the book. You've mentioned Levi and Dante. We've got Chaucer in here, John Donne, Walt Whitman, T.S. Eliot, Elizabeth Bishop. And so there is a huge selection here. And it's it must have been a vast amount of research and work to represent each of these poets in your 3,000 word chapters. And they sort of follow a bit of a pattern, don't they, of you kind of a little bit in media res to begin with. We're asked to imagine the poet in a certain situation. Then we get a bit of background to them and their life and the context. And you give an example of how this reflects through their poetry. So that's is that true to say that's kind of the pattern for each chapter?
And it's a quite tried and true form of almost journalistic writing, I suppose, which I'm familiar with from reading like the London Review of Books or something. You start with a story which can be dated and work from there and go a bit backwards, and then you resolve with kind of the legacy and why it matters now. So it's a form that felt natural.
Yeah,
it did involve a lot of research. But actually, up to a certain point, the research, it had to stop somewhere, or else I wouldn't have got it written.
Absolutely. And it is such a vast panoply of poets, and you tend to focus on one particular sort of work, don't you, for each poet. So again, that narrows the scope, I suppose.
This idea of how to think like a poet, but I wondered if by writing these kind of sketches of these 24 poets that there is a sort of commonality there, that there's something that marks out the poetic mind from people that, don't spend all their lives doing this strange activity.
Yes, I think there is. I've learned to be fairly decisive with that answer. Ironically, because the thing is in some ways to do with indecision and ambiguity. So in the answer I've landed on, certainly for the introduction and running through it then, is John Keats's idea of negative capability. And so I thought I'd just read that passage from his original letter to his brothers, George and Tom, where the idea emerges. So, bit of context, Keats is just writing to his brothers, and it's around Christmas time, and he's talking about everything. He's 22 and he's full of energy and ideas, and he talks about walking home from a panto show with his friends Charles Wentworth Dilke and Charles Armitage Brown. You know, not exactly household names now, but they have an argument. They had a dispute, a disquisition on various subjects. And Keats says, this was the moment where things came together in my mind. Or, as he puts it, several things dovetailed in my mind. And at once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason.
That's such an amazing foundation, I think, really well chosen. I'm just sort of dipping in elsewhere. I was looking at your chapter on Donne, which I really enjoyed. It reminded us about this, as you say in the chapter, of the amalgamating disparate experience. And you talk about he incorporate an image of a typewriter or, you know, just random things, should he have been alive at that time. But the idea, I love how you remind us of the idea of him blurting out his anxieties about making people pregnant while trying to sort of seduce them at the same time. And that is that kind of, that sort of dwelling in uncertainty that, you know, makes so much of Donne so interesting, is the fact that he's able to have these mixed feelings about, you know, even bedding somebody that he wants to bed.
Elegy to his mistress on going to bed is the reference there to the poem, or at least that's what it tends to be called, because he didn't really title his poems.
Yeah, so I sort of learned that from you. Actually, I didn't realise that. It was great,
and I learned it from Catherine Rundell and her great biography of Donne Super Infinite. So, yes, Donne is in many ways the proto-contemporary poet, somebody who's just very comfortable dealing with ephemera and seeing how it all adds to the mix and inflects thought and emotion. And this is, of course, the insight about the Donne and the metaphysical poets, the kind of loose school he was part of. Yeah, and so that's part of what Donne does, but the other is he is just kind of a swaggering great intellect who's always looking to discuss and argue and play games of the kind of linguistic and cerebral sort. I hadn't, I've read that poem, Elegy to His Mistress on Going to Bed, a lot, and I always read the line, as liberally to a midwife show thyself to me, as just a fairly, like, a little bit kinky, as Donne is wont to be, but like good wooing and, like, in some way, I don't know, like romantic. But then it was really sitting with it this time when I had to write about it that I realised that is a very, very risky gambit.
Yeah.
You know, put in the thought of a midwife in the love object's head at a time when the risk of illegitimate pregnancy would have been serious. And so I think he gets a lot of thrill out of walking that tightrope.
Reading the book as well, I just kind of had this sense of, you know, when my, you know, personal heroes were featured, like Amy Césaire, for example, I was so pleased to see him sort of cropping up. Just from my own, you know, personal history. I read him when I was like 20, back in 1980, when nobody had really heard about him. A Caribbean writer friend of mine gave me his cahier, as it were, and just absolutely blew my mind, and to see how influential he's become. But you point out this thing about poetry meeting politics, you know, that he had all these kind of wonderful ideas when he was in Paris with Senghor and the other negritude writers, and then going back and being very decisive. But, you know, that sense of the poetry, that sort of young, poetical, energetic self gradually withering away after encountering reality.
Well, yes, does it wither? So, first of all, I agree. The cahier d'un retour au pays natal, or Journal of a Homecoming, as it's usually translated now. It's mind-blowing, isn't it? And the first time you read it, like, it just blows the doors off. I love it as a poem. And Césaire does have a very, very interesting double life as a radical poet and thinker, and somebody who has a position of like no compromise in his writing, really. It's rebarbative, it's angry, it's exciting and dissonant. But he was mayor of Fort-de-France, the capital of Martinique, his homeland, for 56 years. You know, to begin with, on a communist ticket. He, like many intellectuals, he has disputes with the party over the creep of authoritarianism and Soviet Russia. He's also a deputy to the French Parliament for Martinique, or constituencies in Martinique. And because Martinique is a département growing out of its colonial status. And he was opposed to independence from the French metropole for very pragmatic reasons. And this didn't make him friends on the hard left, who might have been his natural constituency. And I'm just very interested in how he balances that identity, because I don't think it's as simple as selling out. Or the poet withering away, actually. He continues to be a vibrant writer for a long time, even though Cahiers remains his greatest work. I think it must have taken actually huge strength of mind to say, this is the right path, and I'm still going to be no nonsense in my writing and have these decolonial principles. But I think that the right political project for me right now is to work within the system.
And I wonder if we could ask you, you are a creative writing teacher, as you mention in the book, and you do mention a bit about your students. We're interested to know, I mean, the kinds of preoccupations you might have noticed your students having, and creative writing as an art right now. Have you got anything you want to share on that?
Yes, I do. And that's the linchpin of the final chapter on how to think like a contemporary poet, is how I meet the art through my teaching, and the students I teach about poetry and learn from in return, but also try to turn on to the variety of contemporary poetry, because it's always surprising how little contemporary poetry students might have encountered beforehand, and how conditioned by the older traditional canon their understanding still is of the art form. And so as a teacher, I keep having to recalibrate, actually, and find the right initial pitch and introduction to it, because I realize that I've kind of just internalized and naturalized the way things are in the contemporary poetry world as I see them online and in publishing culture. And I assume that has filtered through in some way to my students when they arrive in a university classroom, an undergraduate university classroom, for the first time. And often it just hasn't. And you have to go in there again and make the case for why poetry is the way it is now, why it doesn't rhyme. And sometimes you have to win that case again if you care about making them responsive writers who can fit in with where things stand right now. But of course, it has to be a two-way dialogue. And so one thing that I've been very alert to is, like, where does rhyme fit in these days? Because it's clearly something that won't go away, and nor should it. I truly don't want to end up in the position where rhyme is a fossil that we now see just as an embarrassment in contemporary work.
Presumably you're talking about end rhyme, particularly at this point.
End rhyme, yes. Yes, because actually, contemporary poets, and I'm among contemporary poets now, of course, and I assume that a big, part of the audience listening to the podcast would be contemporary poets as well. We've evolved like sophisticated tools for talking about how rhyme continues to be relevant. Slant rhyme, internal rhyme, other types of assonance. We don't see the fork in the road as starkly as a beginning student might. So yes, I guess I am talking about end rhyme, but, palpable rhyme, but rhyme which stitches the poem together and which gives immediate oral pleasure. I mean stuff which hits you on first hearing.
So are you saying that undergraduate students come to study creative writing and they expect poetry to be like that?
Not necessarily expect it to be like that, but want to write like that.
Oh, right. Okay.
That's sort of from slam and its influence of hip-hop and rapping and so on.
Yeah, rap, slam, performance styles could be part of that, and it's something which the traditional page poetry constituency has to be better at acknowledging and celebrating in its own understanding of the art form. But it's not just that either. Some of it is like out of a more kind of recognizable ballad or romantic form. Well, by recognizable, I just mean a long-standing one. Traditional. So, yeah, rhyme and making sure that there's a space for it and something which speaks to that inner need for pleasure in sound that hits you.
And you do mention in the book, you've only got to look at Paul Muldoon or Don Patterson. There are contemporary poets using end rhyme in a very definite way. So It's not as if it's completely out of bounds.
It's not out of bounds, no. And, well, certainly with Muldoon, I think he speaks to a moment where rhyme itself and end rhyme became a kind of postmodern game, and something which you took pleasure in subverting. Maybe we're seeing a slight recalibration from that point now, and the re-emergence and continued vibrancy of, you could call them folk traditions as well, right? It's not just performance and spoken word, it's folk tradition.
Yeah, and pop songs.
Yeah, Taylor Swift is a big influence on a lot of how I see my students writing.
But having sort of created this collection of 24 poets, I love when you talked about Dylan Thomas, the fact that he's bestriding Welsh literature and kind of you feel this sort of baleful influence of on yourself.
Baleful, but also important and like deeply felt.
Funnily enough, we were in our last uploaded episode, we were talking about Thomas. I'm rather a fan of his, but I'm just wondering, whenever you do something like this, it kind of a big project, it does change you. I wonder if is it just a sort of culmination of things you've already known, or do you feel yourself changed by having written this?
Oh, I don't think it could be as good a book as it is, and I'm proud of the book. I see it as
you should be.
I see it as something which has really brought together my thinking, but I don't think it could be as good a book as I believe it to be if it was some kind of inert like end result of that, like here's what I've learned over the years. These are my final thoughts on the matter. I mean, for goodness sake, I'm in my late 30s, so that would be kind of bleak for the rest of my life and my life with poetry. So there are the poets who I did know well going into this, and in all cases, they were people I had new experiences with and realized that would be an ongoing process as I continued to read them for the rest of my life. And then there were poets who I wasn't that familiar with. Like I knew I had to get my head around them in a new way because I wanted them to be a part of it. My awareness was of their place in the canon. I mean, the learning was endless there. I wanted to wear my continuing education on the sleeve of the book, so to speak, so to dispel some of the illusions of mastery that you get with some magisterial primers, which are intended as this like grand historical sweep.
As a reader, you feel like there's a collaboration going on with you discovering these things. It doesn't feel like, pedagogic. You take the reader with you. And I think that's one of the reasons for how successful it is, that there's an excitement in the chase.
Yeah, and I felt there were definite moments of hilarity, hopefully intentional, I'm not sure, but there's a passage where you talk about how Dante found it it's almost impossible to convey paradise, but he has a good go at it.
Yes, he does, yeah. And those passages of the Divine Comedy are some of the most gorgeous that there are, but completely ineffable and like wild that he ever tried it, really.
Is there a sequel then, do you think? I mean, you said obviously this is not your life's work, but could you see something similar following on, or is that it for now?
I'd always be open to a more overt sequel to it if I could do something, very similar in the same format, which traced not the second division, very much not the second division, but maybe the poets, more kind of connoisseur's choice. Like, this is a little bit the Motown Chartbusters version of it.
Yeah.
And I managed to slip in a few more kind of DJ picks.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
Like, the next one would be a cellar full of Motown.
Deep cuts.
Deeper cuts, which would still be people who are fully known to a lot of people, I'm sure. But then I could afford to just slip in some unusual names.
Yeah.
And I think the straitjacket would be removed. Anyway, I feel like I'm writing the pitch right now. I don't think that's like the next.
No. What are you, I was going to ask you, what are you working on now? Have you got any projects you can share with us? Or
The poetry, of course.
It's poetry.
My poetry. I'm unfortunately a little bit at a crossroads with writing my own poetry. Life has happened to me a lot, and this project took up a lot of writing time. My wife and I were pregnant, and also going through the first year of life with our lovely son Asa. So yeah, I had to focus my energies at that point. So now I find myself having a little bit more time to write poetry again, but you need to find the thread, don't you? And I have an idea, and it's the uniting principle is kind of, where does mercy and forgiveness fit in these days? So I think the working title is called Beyond Mercy, and I need to write, I've got notes, but I need to actually start writing the poems in a meaningful way.
I know what that feels like.
Before I can really say more, I think.
That's interesting.
But that's where my mind is at.
So you're moving into perhaps sort of sounds like a sort of philosophical or spiritual kind of thematic going on there. Or is that being
perhaps
simplistic?
Yeah?
Actually, Peter and I were talking about this earlier, about the beginning of the book where you say poetry is about thinking.
Is the art of thinking.
The art of thinking. And we were sort of debating that a bit.
Yeah, a bit of a provocation.
Well, Dai, you studied literature and philosophy.
Yes.
I did too, and I think we're a special breed.
Yeah.
I spent my weekend among philosophers up near St Andrews.
Oh, right.
And your opening sentence is, poetry is the art of thinking.
Oh yeah, a philosopher might deeply disagree with
if I let that cat out of the bag there, I think it would have caused a bit of an issue.
Yeah. But would they deny, though, what I go on to say, which is that poetry is the nearest that we get to the mess of cognition as it happens?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, because philosophers always retreat down this rabbit hole of logic, don't they, and try to make things seem plausible.
Well, yes, it's about truth conditionality and trying to arrive at a position. And the thinking that goes into that is hugely important. But in most analytical philosophy papers, it would be left on the cutting room floor, wouldn't it? You'd have to marshal your thinking in a completely different way. My provocation to the philosopher would be that the great works of philosophy, what you see is kind of the diamond at the end of thought, rather than necessarily the action of thinking.
Interesting.
I love this idea of perhaps leaving you on the note of provoking philosophers.
Yeah, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough, philosophers.
I like that. That's a good sum up at the end of the interview, I think. Well, thanks very much, Dai. It's been great, really interesting.
It has been great.
And thank you so much for coming on. What an amazing book, really, the scope of it all, as we've said.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's perfect for Christmas.
I would say that, yes.
Published by
Bloomsbury Continuum.
Excellent. So that was was a bit unusual, wasn't it? Both of us in on that interview.
Yeah.
It felt a bit weird, actually.
Gate crashing in your interview with Dai. It would make a really good gift, for people like us, confirmed poetry readers. It does remind you of some really good poets, and also some of the chapters, for example, on Langston Hughes and Rabindranath Tagore, poets that I'm not that familiar with. Also having a chapter about Audre Lorde, we've read from one of her essays on here as well.
Yeah.
All adds up to a kind of a very convincing cast of characters that lead us to where we are today, really, in terms of modern poetry. A lot of these people have got palpable influences. And I think Dai was saying that they're not necessarily his favourite poets.
Yeah, yeah.
You have to be a bit generous about how you approach it, because otherwise you say, where's W.B. Yeats? For example.
Yeah, not a single Irish poet on there, I don't think.
Yeah. Where's Anna Akhmatova? And you could just go
absolutely.
Play that game.
Yeah, Cavafy.
Yeah, where is he?
But I think he admitted that he was also on a bit of an agenda to try and skew what might be seen as a sort of canon, which he describes at various points in the book as basically the work of old, white, pale and stale men.
Curse them.
Which, I was thinking afterwards, is that not our view of a Western canon? Anyone who reads this book, even if they are a working poet or they've done a literature degree or whatever, I bet there's at least one poet that they're not familiar with. You might know the name, but I bet there's at least one, if not more.
Like there's a chapter on Li Bai, for example, that Yang Lian was talking about in that interview we did with him.
Yes, yes.
So, yeah, I really think this is inclusive and interesting and provocative and so on. So, yeah. And if he does a sequel, the substitute on the bench get called on.
Yeah. I liked the way he talked about the poets sort of thing, possibly. Although I felt there was a bit of that already in the final chapter, the how to think like a contemporary poet. He pulled in some names there that I felt were quite random choices as exemplars. But he did say, didn't he, he didn't want to pull up living poets and suggest this is how they're thinking. Yeah. So perhaps he was just a bit careful in the final chapter.
He spoke with approval about Dan S. Smith.
He did, yeah.
We interviewed them on the podcast this season as well. So there's a generosity about his approach that is warm and inclusive and really helps you get under the skin of a wide range of writers. And I think, for me, that enthusiasm and proper scholarly engagement with them while being easy to read.
Yes.
It makes it a really interesting book to have on your shelf.
You've summed it up very well there. So is that a Christmas present? You getting that for anybody?
If you've got that friend that's kind of poetry curious.
Poetry curious, yes, yes.
This would be a great one.
How do you pinpoint a friend who's poetry curious? It's one of those things that I've been in book groups where just the word poetry has brought people out in a rash. And there's others where you get a polite kind of, oh, yes. And you sort of think, are they curious or are they just really being polite? Every year now I get together with some old school pals and we always do a Secret Santa of a book.
Oh, that's a good idea.
And this year I thought, you know what, I'm just going to give away my favourite Kim Adenizio book. And I defy whoever picks it out of the hat to not enjoy that. Even if they're not poetry curious, we shall find out.
Some of my very closest friends absolutely detest poetry. And I quite like that because I find it quite bracing. It's like a sort of reality pill,
Absolutely.
In fact, I gave a copy of the recent sampler I was in, which had three poets' work, to my next-door neighbour, who's in his very late 80s.
Yeah.
A fiercely intelligent man who then sent me an email about how much he detested poetry.
Oh, no. After you'd given him your poems.
Yeah.
Oh,
I thought it might be interesting for him, but it turns out that poetry is just too vague to be of any interest. So,
well, I think when you get to that age, you're entitled to say exactly what you think, aren't you?
Yeah. There's a cast of mind that doesn't really like dwelling in that negative capability of those imaginings and uncertainties and things that...
Negative capability. We've never managed to discuss that. It's always like, shall we talk about that?
I think we'll just park it with Dai. He seemed to know what he was talking about.
Well, I think you and he had a good few words about that. I was impressed. I was happy to stay out of that conversation.
I was bluffing, yeah.
So guess what, Peter?
What?
The bloopers are back.
Oh, good.
Last year we didn't do any outtakes, but you know how I like to celebrate the odd unprofessional moment. I know it's hard to believe we have them.
Yeah.
Here's a teeny selection of some of the moments when we got it a teeny bit wrong. Let's hear a bit about what she had. Let's hear a bit about what Mimi. What did I say about?
I'm thinking of T.S. Eliot Prize winner Before Last. What was that one?
Oh.
I talked about her. This is going well.
Sure, I can look it up quickly. They were good enough to impress her for her to pass them on to publishers. And I remember because one of those poets was someone I can't remember. God.
I ask him where all this stuff comes from, as no truck travels this road. Sorry, I'm just screwing this up.
Oh God, I need matchsticks or something. Why am I so napped?
No.
God.
Were you singing your little heart out?
I was, yeah. So I look at myself on the screen thinking, oh God, I need a facelift, I need something there.
Oh, don't. I definitely need a haircut.
That's a lot cheaper.
And the Mahabharata, Mahabharata.
That's probably it. And I remember that book that was it shortlisted for the Eliot's, his book. I can't even remember the names of these. I'll have to insert it later. Anyway, which was a tour de force, I think, and I think it was shortlisted for the Eliot's, but that was based on it was not based on. It was a kind of. I'll cut that bit. Okay, fine. Carry on.
So, Robin, I understand you've been reading a book by one of our previous guests on. What is it? I'm not very firing on all the cylinders this one.
That's fine. I can't be able to do that all over again. I'll lose the will to live again. So here we are. It's Christmas.
Christmas 2024. I'm full of glee. Are you doing anything special to celebrate this festive time? I believe you're going to be on stage and singing beautifully with the Lewis Singers.
That's right. My other life is with the Lewis Singers. So, it's a chamber choir, and we're doing 2 concerts at the weekend, on Friday in Brighton and Sunday in Lewis. And I'm also singing with the East Sussex Community Choir in Lewis Town Hall on Saturday night.
Yeah.
All of those gigs are pretty much
They're
sold out.
But, yeah.
All the concerts seems to be well attended this year. I think people just want a bit of carols and tradition and candlelight and all that.
Yeah,
a bit of singing along, the holly and the ivy or whatever. But Peter, you've been doing some very, very festive things lately. I hear you went on a snowy railway journey.
Yeah, we were up in Scotland, and Mrs. Kenny has got this thing where if you put her on a steam train, she starts crying. It's really weird. And we found this out in Swanage once.
Is it because she's remembering, that last scene in The Railway Children? Because that was a bit weepy.
Yeah, no, it's a weird phenomenon. Nobody can quite understand it. So anyway, we went up to Scotland to see my stepson and his lovely wife, Jade. And as a Christmas present, they drove us north into the Cairngorms, into the mountains, which were all snowy capped.
Lovely.
To go on a steam train. But it was a Santa Express. So it was full of these very extra elves who were all kind of running around it was full of children, we discovered when we were on it.
Yeah.
And a very kind of softly spoken Santa.
You have been a professional Santa in the past, haven't you? So how did he rate on the... Is he okay as a Santa?
I didn't hear a single ho, 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 which I think is,
no.
a bit regrettable. But as it was chugging through, something about the temperature, because it was really cold, the steam coming out of the steam train just kind of lay there by the side of the train. So suddenly we were going through trees that were full of this suspended steam, and it was absolutely magical. And then, looking up at the snowy mountains, that was when I started feeling Christmassy properly. So, and I love this time of year.
Oh, it's lovely. And we don't get much snow, if any, do we, down here, down in the south of England. So it's nice to go and seek it out. Anyway,
probably enough about festive musings. I mean, it's a great time of year to catch up on reading and so on. Have you got anything in the tubes of your reading submarine?
Well, yeah. Yes. Actually, it's not poetry as such, but there's a link to poetry.
Yeah.
I'm actually rereading, I'm not sure. I found it on my bookshelf. I've had this book for many years, and I've tried to read it before, but I'm definitely reading it this time. And it's Italo Calvino's novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveller.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And it's a bit of a classic. It's postmodern.
Mm.
Calvino was part of the OuLiPo group of writers, and I think that's come up before, hasn't it, on Planet Poetry, OuLiPo.
I think Richard Skinner was talking about that. Yeah, he's quite
he's into that.
A scholar of this sort of thing, yeah.
Yeah. It's a loose gathering of, I think, mainly French-speaking writers and mathematicians. And it was started in 1960, and what they like to do is to write within certain constraints.
Yeah.
And the more constrained, the more exciting is the idea. And also the idea is that you write within these constraints, and your goal is not to necessarily make sense or to finish or to have a product that at the end of it that you've got in mind. The idea is to be completely open-minded as to what comes out when you start writing. So the kinds of constraints are typically, there's one called S+7, or sometimes it's called N+7. And what it is you replace every noun in a text with the seventh noun after it in a dictionary.
Oh, okay.
Sounds like a game, doesn't it? And then another famous restraint is to not use a certain letter or letters. So there's a novel called Avoid by a Mr. Perrich. I can't remember his first name. I haven't written it down here. Avoid actually avoids using the letter E in the entire novel. So that was an interesting constraint. We've had this idea of a constraint recently. Do you remember in Isabel Gallimor's interview a few episodes ago, she talks about she had a section of her book where she wanted to have I think it's 100 syllables only per page, something like that.
Yeah.
So it's that sort of a thing, and there are all kinds of these constraints that the OuLiPo writers use. And so Calvino is into that. So this novel is written, the basic structure of it is it's got every chapter is kind of divided into two. There's two halves. And in the first half, you're being addressed, you. It's in the second person. And you're being talked at as if you are about to read a book, or you're trying to read this book. And the second half of each chapter is the start of a novel that you're allegedly supposed to be reading. But it gets complicated because every chapter, this second half, is a different novel each time.
Oh, yes, yeah.
So, and then when you get to the end, you find out, spoiler alert, that the title of each chapter, if you put them all together at the end, it makes a long sentence starting with, if on a winter's night a traveller. So there's all kinds of games being played here, and it is intriguing. It's the sort of thing I think I'm going to enjoy over the Christmas break. I'm going to read and keep an open mind, and I think I'm going to enjoy it. I hope so.
I'm pleased people do write stuff like that, but
it does sound a bit crazy. But if you think about poetry, a lot of forms are constraints. And in fact, I was looking for examples of OuLiPo poetry, and I found one or two sestinas. And in fact, that is quite a difficult form, isn't it? And you could say it's not a dissimilar idea that you use this quite restrictive pattern of words and lines and stanza lengths.
Yeah, people do like working within constraints, don't they? And, imposing a sort of arbitrary or kind of almost mathematical constraint on what you're doing can yield interesting results.
Yeah.
Although, yeah, sometimes that kind of stuff just makes me feel a bit frustrated, though.
Well, like Fibonacci poetry.
That's not for me.
I had to laugh when I found out that OuLiPo, it was founded by a group of men, and there are very few female members, but it's still going. It has a website. It's still a thing.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm getting stuck into. I was going to come along today with something festive, a lovely Christmassy poem, but I didn't get around to that. But I think maybe you've got something for us.
Well, yeah, I've got something we talked about before by Alfred Lord Tennyson.
Ah, yes.
From his In Memoriam. And there's one it's been turned into a song, Ring Out, Wild Bells to the Wild Sky is the first line of it. But it's very much about turning a page on grief and miserable things and looking forward with kind of clarion calls to the new year and how splendid that might be.
Now, we need that, don't we? That's an excellent thing to be thinking about at the end of this year.
It's almost a banishment of the old, and there's a sense of optimism born out of this grief that he has going through that long book of his. Because you've read it all, I've dipped into it here and there. But anyway, should we have a blast of Alfred Lord Tennyson?
Let's have a blast. I've got a soft spot for Tennyson. Always happy to hear him.
Not a person that featured in Dai George's pantheon of stars, but...
as you said, a lot of people had to be left out.
Yeah, I think he'd struggle to get into the third team these days.
Unfashionable.
Yes,
what a shame.
Well, I bite my thumb at this idea of fashionable and unfashionable.
Absolutely.
So, I'll give this a go then. Ring out, wild bells, to the wild sky, the flying cloud, the frosty light. The year is dying in the night. Ring out, wild bells, and let him die. Ring out the old, ring in the new. Ring happy bells across the snow. The year is going, let him go. Ring out the false, ring in the true. Ring out the grief that saps the mind. For those that here we see no more. Ring out the feud of rich and poor. Ring in redress to all mankind. Ring out a slowly dying cause and ancient forms of party strife. Ring in the nobler modes of life with sweeter manners, purer laws. Ring out the want, the care, the sin, the faithless coldness of the times. Ring out my mournful rhymes, but ring the fuller minstrel in. Ring out false pride in place and blood, the civic slander and the spite. Ring in the love of truth and right. Ring in the common love of good. Ring out old shapes of foul disease. Ring out the narrowing lust of gold. Ring out the 1,000 wars of old. Ring in the 1,000 years of peace. Ring in the valiant man and free, the larger heart, the kindlier hand. Ring out the darkness of the land. Ring in the Christ that is to be.
There's so much that's so relevant in that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, it ends on a sort of Christian line, but it could have been written about this year, couldn't it? All the stuff about let's get back to truth and, ring out the false, ring in the true.
Yeah.
Ring out a slowly dying cause and ancient forms of party strife.
Yeah. Just all this old, horrible, entrenched conflict that we find revivified again.
Oh, God, yeah. Sweeter manners. Let's have some sweeter manners. I'd love that.
Yeah, so on that note, we're opening new media channels for Planet Poetry away from the cesspit that is X.
Oh, yes.
In terms of places that are a bit sweeter. So we're going to Blue Sky, I think.
Yes. We don't want to be dwelling in the bad place. We want to be in a better place.
Yeah, while it stays better.
So follow us there, please.
And while we're talking about our listeners, I think it really is well overdue that we thank everyone yet again for tuning into us.
Yeah.
And it's just so comforting to know that people are actually listening to us and we're connecting with other people, and to be able to sit in your earphones and chat to you is an enormous privilege for both of us, isn't it, really?
It is. And we've said it before, and we're not going to be boring about it, but we do have costs and we cover them ourselves with the help of some very lovely donors. And everyone who's bought us a cup of coffee at buymeacoffee.com/planetpoetry, we want to say to you thank you, and particularly our members
Our glorious
members who donate a regular amount each month, and it really does help us keep going, and we'd like to thank them personally for their support.
So their names are Claire Best,
Charlie Beaumont,
and Richard Chadburn are our three angels at the moment.
Yes, we're very grateful.
Deck the halls with boughs of holly.
Now we're off for a short break, and we're back in January with a wonderful episode in which Peter interviews Ruth Padel. So don't miss that.
She's amazing, very impressive poet.
So all that remains is for us to
wish all our listeners a season's greetings.
Yes.
And warm wishes for this festive period and also the new year. I'm actually going off to climb into my Santa suit. I've sort of semi-retired now as a Santa, but I'm off to see some friends and their grandchildren in the capacity of Santa.
Oh, lovely.
I can do a ho 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 for you if you like.
Oh yes, do.
Yeah, what I do is use my chest voice. Ho ho ho.
That's slightly frightening, actually. I'm sure when it comes with the whole package of the beard and the coat,
ho ho
and
ho,
the suit. Excellent. Merry Christmas.
God bless us.